I learned a lot in school, but most of what I learned was not from the professors. And it's not because the professors aren't good people, smart people, capable people. It's because fundamentally most of the learning really happens at a parallel level to our peers. About a month ago, I had a video about some educational theory stuff relating to how and why I teach the way that I do. I'll link in the description if you're curious. But kind of a similar thread today, in fact, quoting one of the same sources, Henry David Thoreau's Walden from 170 years ago. And I like these sources in part because, again, even though what we're doing is sort of a very modern, weird twist on how teaching happens and what we do in Home Team, the roots far predate modern life, far predate the internet. So this is Henry David Thoreau in Walden from, again, 170 years ago or so. Those things for which the most money are demanded are never the things which the student most wants. Tuition, for instance, is an important item in the term bill, while the far more valuable education which he gets by associating with the most cultivated of his contemporaries, no charge is made. And a bit out of order, but it's literally the sentence before this to make clear that this is about a financial consideration from Henry David Thoreau Walden long ago when a completely different structure was the case for education. Those conveniences which the student requires at Cambridge or elsewhere cost him or somebody else 10 times as great a sacrifice of life as they would with proper management on both sides. A person in front of the room spouting ideas, talking about what they know, doesn't actually soak into you, right? There's this incorrect notion about how education happens that students are buckets, and if the teacher just pours out enough stuff, well, then enough of that's going to gather in those buckets. And fundamentally, it's just not. At best, there might be some relevant hooks in there so that when we go read, when we go apply ourselves to doing projects and doing things, then certain things might stick a little better because it's not our first exposure to it. But very little of what they are trying to wash over us and write on the whiteboard, is trying to erase, to copy down notes in the notepad, are sticking, are useful, are usable to us. And really the learning happens and starts when we start doing stuff, and more importantly, from our peers, as, again, Henry David Thoreau mentions. Now, so in the case of Home Team, for example, even though I'm there as a trainer, as a supporter, there to help get people unstuck, it's in the context of their own projects. And fundamentally, most of the learning that they're really gaining is from their peers with an asterisk. So two things about this. One, the other day we had some confusion about Krister's connection to what goes on in Home Team. Now, if you don't know Krister goes by McFunkyPants online. He has for a long time been a mentor in residence in Home Team. And what that means is that he's sort of like a teacher, but he doesn't teach, again, in the traditional sense, just like I don't either. He instead makes direct contributions on the current team projects that members are pitching, leading, and building together. So he'll drop in there a really impressive way to do some neat underwater fish, or a cool way to make some particle effects happen with some surprisingly simple code. Or he'll make some visual polish tweaks, just applying some of his 35 some odd years as a maybe 40 by now independent freelance game developer professional. And a lot of the learning comes from, you can see directly the demonstration of how he solved these problems in the same context that you are working in as a member. You can directly look at his code in GitHub. You can ask him about his approach. He's happy to explain what he was doing. But again, the learning here is at a peer level. And so the idea is that if part of what you're learning from is your peers, well, then a lot of your learning can benefit from having an embedded peer who is more experienced than you. And this is the same thing that also happens where our veteran members of the group who've been around for many years, led several projects, been major contributors on many projects, splashing around in the same pool, so to speak, as the newer members. A lot of the learning that happens is a transfer from them of when a question comes up, when there's a puzzle about how to do something, just as much as I can draw from games I've released, their peers can suggest some ideas or some feedback or some notes based on, here's what we've seen work, here's some downsides to that approach or some upsides to that approach, and it still happens at a peer-to-peer level where a lot of learning comes from. That difference in gap is where it's easier for us to learn from our peers on the same projects in the same contexts, rather than if it's someone at the front of the room spouting at you, giving classes, it might as well be a video on YouTube. Might as well be a video on Udemy. May as well just press play if it's going to be you and hundreds of people sitting around with somebody talking on a stage. But this is also one of the reasons why team learning is so fundamental to what we do versus solo. When it's solo, there's so much reinventing the wheel. There's so much inability to see our own weaknesses, our own gaps, our own issues in the same way as soon as someone else is involved, just like the video from the other day talked about sort of the small town or the neighbor effect. As soon as there's other people involved in the same code base, you become much more self-aware about caring about, is this the best way to do this? Is this the right way to do this? Even though there's an ingredient in there, it's possible to make code too elegant, to get too lost in the details. We don't do that either. But you become much more conscientious of, is this process going to complicate or cause issues for others? That elevates the quality at which we do things, the level at which we learn, our ability to apply things in a bigger context than what we can do solo, and it deepens that learning. But again, all we're talking about today, right, is just this effect where the learning largely comes from our peers rather than who's in front of a classroom. It's part of why when people talk about home team, they'll refer to it as classes. Sometimes I have to clarify, like, no, it's not classes. That's definitely not what happens. We have experienced people like Krister, myself, multiple time project leads as well in home team, who get involved directly on projects, and part of the learning comes from peeking across to how somebody else in the same project is doing something in a code base you're familiar with, solving puzzles in a context you're building a top, you're building things that interface to it. And this even ties a little bit into the question of a lot of bigger projects, no one will ever see 100% of that code ever understand, even the project leads. You just can't. If you could, it would be a solo project. There's too many pieces. And so the way that you interface that and kind of gain and grok more of it is each time you're working on a piece, you work on the stuff that's connected to it. You learn just enough that's adjacent to it to do what you're doing. And then you take on another area, take on another piece, each time increasing sort of the surface area of parts that you understand because you've made a thing that connects to that, relates to that, spins off from that, ties to that process, builds on a pattern someone else put in place. And then that sort of, we get this big Venn diagram or big spider web of people's knowledge areas overlapping. So it's, okay, well, if the AI is doing something, we have a question about that. Well, Neil over here worked on that. Speaking of which, Neil, thank you for adding AI to Bush League Hockey. May not be live on itch yet by the time I did this, but games in post-release, Neil's been doing awesome work over there. But anyway, once again, want to stress that if you want to join us in Home Team, you can apply at hometeamgamedev.com. We do not have too long of a wait list currently. It's a good time of year to get in there, especially if you're going to be able to cover your own dues. If not, again, cannot stress enough, our sponsor program is there for a reason. If it's a good fit for your situation, just check the box on there. Might be a longer wait. But we've had people who've thrived in that opportunity, got jobs from it, been multiple time leads and so on, if they're a good fit. So fill out that application. Check out hometeamgamedev.com for details. Aside from that, catch you on another day. Thanks for being here. Bye for now.